Video game emulators, as we know them, are programs designed to imitate the hardware of a specified video game console or handheld, facilitating the ability to play that platform's games on your own personal computer via ROM files, which are copies of cartridge data, or ISO images, which are copies of optical disc media. More often than not, emulators allow games to surpass their original performance limitations with a variety of features depending on the emulator used. A lot of them allow you to increase the game speed, create save states at any moment without the need for in-game save points, apply visual filters, use a generous amount of anti-aliasing for greater detail, enable one-click cheat codes, and activate things like frame rate unlocks and widescreen hacks for modern monitors and TVs. Of course, not all platform emulators work flawlessly the day they're released to the public. Compatibility on a game-by-game basis is still an issue for many, especially for platforms that might have notoriously complicated and difficult hardware and architecture. But overall, the existence of emulators have proven to be a huge benefit to the gaming community for many reasons. The earliest emulators began to spring up in the mid-90s, specifically for consoles like the NES, the SNES, and MAME, which emulated multiple different arcade systems. Back then, one of the greatest benefits offered by these programs was access to foreign games. In the 90s, there were still tons of games releasing in Japan that would never be seen in America, and emulation bridged the gap between communities and allowed American audiences to experience games they would never play at all unless they were willing to jump through crazy hoops, spend a ton of money, and wait weeks just to import one copy. In relation to that, emulation also opened the door for fan translations of those Japanese games. One of the most popular examples of this was RPGE's late 90s fan translation of Final Fantasy V, which had not been released outside of Japan, because back then, Squaresoft was following a very strange localization pipeline, releasing Final Fantasy I in the West as Final Fantasy I, but skipping 2 and 3, then releasing Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II in North America, then skipping 5, and then releasing 6 as 3. A very stupid idea in the long run, as they soon realized. This widely discussed fan project helped bring more and more eyes to the emulation scene, and ever since then, the emulating community has only continued to see growth. And nowadays, consoles get emulators created even while they're still being manufactured, particularly Nintendo platforms, as they've always been pretty easy to mimic, hardware-wise. From a legal standpoint, emulators by themselves are perfectly fine. Console manufacturers in the past have tried to sue companies, entities, or individuals for creating emulators or simply reverse engineering a console to better understand its security measures, but failed, ultimately accomplishing the opposite and assuring the safety of emulation. Examples include the Sega vs. Accolade case of 1992, Sony Computer Entertainment vs. Connectix Corporation case of 2000, and Sony Computer Entertainment vs. Bleem case of 2000. These cases have all helped to guarantee the legal validity of emulators, and clearing up the fact that it's how you use those emulators that might land a person in hot water. But even so, millions of people around the world use emulators, especially for games that they've never owned and will never be re-released, and for consoles that are no longer in production, as buying them secondhand might be a total crapshoot on whether they're still functional or not, assuming you have a compatible TV and cabling. It's something we're technically not allowed to do, but it's so scarcely enforced that we do it anyway. Even Android smartphones have access to emulators in the official Play Store. So, instead of going after people who use emulators, video game publishers with a chip on their shoulder, like Nintendo specifically, would rather spend their time and effort going after websites that host and distribute ROMs and ISOs. Even if consoles today don't support backwards compatibility as widely as they once did, it's easy to play old games on PC. Even a half-decent non-gaming computer can easily handle running games up to the 6th generation of consoles, meaning the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and original Xbox. The newer a console is, however, the more difficult it may be to emulate it, especially if it has particularly strange architecture, like the PS3. It's a 16-year-old machine at this point, but its leading emulator, RPCS3, has only 63% of its library listed as playable from start to finish. A decent number overall, yes, but still pales in comparison to its predecessor's leading emulator, PCSX2, boasting an incredible 98% playable. And then there's the Xbox 360, whose leading emulator, Xenia, has 281 games listed as playable, according to the compatibility list on the project's GitHub page, which is just 13% of the console's entire library. And all these programs are being updated and supported, typically by people doing it in their spare time. They are troopers, plain and simple, and their efforts continue to make gaming easier for everyone. At the end of the day, emulation on PC will always be there for us, even if it's imperfect or incomplete. But what if, with their own resources at their disposal, all of the console manufacturers, especially Sony and Microsoft since they always used optical discs as their storage media, decided to get serious about using emulation as a means of offering backwards compatibility? They've all done it before to some extent, so a precedent does exist, and Sony especially has been at the center of this conversation for a while, with accusations thrown at them for not caring about old games. But what if Sony put forth the money and effort into making an emulator that has a high compatibility rate for the libraries of all PlayStation consoles, and then put it on the PlayStation 5 for everyone to use, by simply putting our old discs in and playing? The reason I've been thinking about emulation so much recently, particularly in relation to Sony, is because, back in late March of this year, PlayStation went into detail about their future changes to the PlayStation Plus subscription service. They revealed a new, tiered service that offered greater benefits the higher the tier you signed up for. And at the top of the new PlayStation Plus subs is PlayStation Plus Premium, which boasts all the perks of the previous two tiers, but with additional access to hundreds of other games, including a catalog of PS3 games via cloud streaming, and a catalog of PS1, PS2, and PSP games available via both streaming and download. The new tiered service isn't expected to roll out in North America until mid-June, but the fact that PS1, 2, and PSP games are stated as available for download suggests that some type of emulation will be present to facilitate playing the games on your console, and this was more recently confirmed to be the case. But the fact that there's a specific number tied to it suggests that only a select amount of games will be prioritized for support. We know why PS3 games couldn't be given backwards compatibility support for PS4. The console's architecture was complicated. Needlessly so, even according to some game developers, and thus, games running on it had extra work put into them to ensure they could function on the machine. And even then, many multi-platform games performed worse on Sony's machine than on the Xbox 360. Thus, the PS4 ended up being the first Sony console to not support backwards compatibility in any form for its predecessor. Plus, there was the scare last year of Sony saying they plan on taking down the PS3, PSP, and Vita online stores, which was retracted due to community backlash. Basically, they've had little trouble in allowing themselves to come off as a company who doesn't care about allowing people to play older games, especially when President and CEO Jim Ryan basically said this himself. In a 2017 interview with Time, he stated, "When we've dabbled with backwards compatibility, I can say it is one of those features that is much requested but not actually used much. That, and I was at a Gran Turismo event recently where they had PS1, PS2, PS3, and PS4 games. And the PS1 and the PS2 games, they looked ancient. Like, why would anybody play this?" Needless to say, these comments drew some criticism, and rightfully so, and many people would go on to remember his words as the years went on. Comparatively, Xbox has been putting in a lot of work to ensure that a selection of games going back to the original Xbox generation could still be playable on the current-day platforms. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours was put into testing their own backwards compatibility solutions so that several hundred Xbox 360 titles and several dozen original Xbox titles can function on Xbox One and Series X. And it seems Sony might be taking this route with future classic releases on their tiered PlayStation Plus service. Microsoft's efforts are very much respectable and appreciated. but unfortunately, they've reached the limit of their support because the rest of the console's libraries are inhibited due to licensing, legal, and technical constraints. The former two reasons, licensing and legal issues, are big contributors as to why a lot of games are under threat of never seeing the light of day again. I go into detail in my old video, Why Video Games Need Piracy, the Industry's Preservation Problem, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. But long story short, thousands upon thousands of games are stuck in a weird legal limbo where they can't be re-released in any official capacity due to the fact that their publishers and developers no longer exist and no one knows who technically owns the games anymore, or because parts of the games, often music, characters, or historical footage, are owned by a different company that might not exist anymore. Games like these are considered abandonware, and people download and share them openly knowing that no corporate entity will go out of their way to stop them. But it'll take decades for these games to actually hit public domain. Even the first games ever released commercially in the early 1970s won't be public domain until the 2050s. For those thousands of games almost lost to time and legal ambiguity, emulation is the only way for them to live on in people's hearts and minds. Bringing the conversation back to PlayStation, with the highest tier of the new PlayStation Plus, subscribers will be able to play a selected amount of classics on their consoles through some kind of emulation. This is, generally speaking, a great thing. Sony very recently also clarified that if you downloaded any PS1 or PSP classics through the PS3 and those games are added to the lineup, then you'll be able to re-download them again without subscribing to PlayStation Plus at all. That's really nice. The most pessimistic members of the PlayStation user base might not have expected this much leniency. But the big question everyone wants to know is, will it ever be possible to simply let people put their old PS1 and PS2 discs into their PS5 and play them the old-fashioned way? Because, at the end of the day, that is the absolute best way to offer a form of backwards compatibility, because it doesn't severely limit the amount of supported titles, and it saves a lot of money compared to implementing any sort of hardware-based solutions. The PS1 and PS2 had massive libraries. The PlayStation 1 had a total of 4,105 games in its catalog. The PlayStation 2 had a total of 4,380. And the PlayStation Portable comes in at a respectably big 1,925. Adding all of these numbers together, we get 10,410. If Sony were to follow Xbox's example and begin to hand-pick different titles to test and support themselves, how many could they realistically do over 7 years, assuming the team doing this is decently large and focused solely on this task? For comparison, Xbox was able to add support for 632 out of 2,134 Xbox 360 games, and 63 out of 997 games for the original Xbox, for a total of 695 out of 3,151 games across both libraries. Maybe Sony will hit at least 1,000, or 1,500, maybe even 2,000 across all three platforms. A very impressive number, yes, but that's still only 20% of their combined catalogs. This is why it could be a big deal to just put a broadly functioning emulator out there for people to use the discs they probably already own. And I know PSP uses the UMD format, which is not a typical disc that could be inserted into a PS5. But maybe Sony could stand to make a decent amount of pocket change by making a physical accessory which you can connect to the PS5 to read PSP UMDs and play them on the console. In fact, let's assume that accessory does end up being made, and the emulator for the PS1, 2, and PSP is accessible to anyone who owns a PS5, thus making the console backwards compatible via emulation for almost all generations of PlayStation machines, save for the PS3 and Vita. This actually wouldn't be the first time Sony did something like this. Certain 60GB and 80GB post-launch models of the PS3 actually had software-based backwards compatibility for PS1 and PS2 games. This was a cost-cutting measure because the launch 20 and 80GB models had hardware-based emulation, meaning They all basically had a small PlayStation 2 inside of them, which made them more expensive to manufacture and made each machine larger and heavier to boot. So let's assume this new emulator on the PS5 has a generous compatibility rate of 99%, meaning that 99% of each platform's entire game library is playable from start to finish. Who benefits from this? This is often the biggest argument against backwards compatibility. No one buys a new console for old games. Even Jim Ryan used this train of thought to justify his allergy to supporting old titles. Now, ignoring the fact that the inclusion of backwards compatibility is always a benefit to the consumer and never a detriment, let's actually try to get into the numbers. Let's try and determine a ballpark estimate of how many games and people might benefit from the PS5 having a good emulator as a means of software-based backwards compatibility. First, let's take a glance over to actual sales figures. The PlayStation 1 sold a total of over 102 million units, and its total game or software sales were 962 million, meaning every PS1 sold had 9 to 10 games attached to it on average. The PlayStation 2 sold a total of over 155 million units, the best-selling home console of all time, and its total software sales were 1.5 billion. So every PS2 sold, again, had 9 to 10 games on average. And finally, the PSP sold between 80 to 82 million units, with software sales of 318 million, meaning every PSP sold had about 3 to 4 games with it on average. Added together, that's a sum of 2.78 billion games across all three platforms, and with the exception of the PSP's later life, the vast majority of these sales, almost all of them, were when the PlayStation Store didn't exist, meaning a massive portion of these figures are physical game copies. But of course, some of you might be thinking, there's no way all 2.7 billion copies are functional today though. And you're right. These are old games, so it's crazy to think each and every one is still perfectly intact and playable. So let's make the number smaller. Let's get extra cynical and assume 95% of all those game copies are either lost or damaged beyond repair. That still means 139 million PS1, PS2, and PSP physical game copies are still out there in the world. And the only way they're being played, assuming they're being played, is if the owner has a working PS1, PS2, PSP, or early PS3 model, which are old pieces of technology no longer in production. Or they're putting the discs into a PC and running them off an emulator anyway. Beyond that, they're just collecting dust. And to relate back to my earlier talking point, who knows how many of these games are ones that also don't have a snowball's chance in hell at ever being re-released due to legal or licensing problems. Or, even more irritatingly, because of something like lost source codes. Take Silent Hill 2 and 3 for example, two of the best games in the PS2 and Xbox generation and landmarks in the survival horror genre. Their original versions aren't available on any digital storefronts today due to Konami losing their source codes, meaning ISOs and old physical copies are the only way to enjoy them. Otherwise, you'll have to settle for the subpar HD collection versions instead. Or, if recent rumors are to be believed, wait for a remake of one of them, assuming the remake meets the standards set by the original. Even though these old copies might continue to slowly diminish in number by either breaking or being thrown away, they still typically end up in the hands of people who intend to play them, or at the very least keep them in playable condition. And with 139 million copies floating around, how many millions of people are they spread across? We've established that every PS1 and PS2 sold had 9 to 10 games attached to it on average. If that ratio stays consistent, then that means around 14 million people have old games lying around, and that's after we purposely cut the number of still playable copies down by 95%. 14 million people who could potentially benefit from emulation of older games on the PS5. And this hypothetical figure doesn't even include people who might gain an interest in older games if the emulator were announced to be freely available. I know, at the end of the day these numbers I'm presenting are all pure speculation. But regardless of how many game copies might actually be out there, interest in old games will still always exist. You don't even need to take my word for it, just look at what's being released. There's been a pretty recent uptick in companies dedicating a certain amount of resources exclusively towards re-releasing old games for current generation platforms, sometimes even physically. Konami released multiple collections of old Contra and Castlevania games. Disney's been re-releasing a bunch of older Star Wars games and platformers. Bethesda and id Software keep re-releasing Doom games and released a major update for Quake, including a PS5 version. SNK's been releasing new updates of older King of Fighters games. Capcom's been releasing collections of Street Fighter entries as well as bundles of their more niche fighting games. And Square Enix just recently launched an entire line of new remasters for all of their pixel-based mainline Final Fantasy titles. These companies wouldn't do these things if interest in these old games wasn't significant enough to warrant the effort. And just in the year 2020, we had a ton of complete remakes of old classics. Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil 3, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Mafia, Trials of Mana, Destroy All Humans, Battle for Bikini Bottom, and Black Mesa. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's way more examples of companies still giving attention to older titles than these. Interest in older games will always exist. It'll never be more than the interest of new games, obviously, but there will always be a collection of people who either want to experience an older game for the first time or simply relive old memories. There's always going to be more old games than there will be new games, so we can't expect every developer and publisher to offer an equal amount of love to each and give them all the re-releases they could benefit from, especially when those developers and publishers might not even exist anymore. Oftentimes, going back and dusting off an old console is the only way to play certain games, especially franchises that span multiple generations. A prime example that I always fall back on is Metal Gear Solid. It's a renowned series that still has many die-hard fans in spite of its current dormant status and uncertain future. It would still be possible for MGS to gain new fans if it just weren't a total annoyance to play all the games. Assuming you want to dive into the Metal Gear Solid series for the first time, but also avoid the usage of ISOs and emulators, you can buy Metal Gear Solid 1 from GOG.com. MGS2 was also there for a brief moment, but it is currently delisted because Konami needs to renew licenses on historical footage used in the game. See how licensing problems can screw over a game's availability? And we don't even know when it'll be back. As for Metal Gear Solid 3, it never received a PC port to begin with, and it's currently not available on any console or handheld that's currently still in production. Same goes for Peace Walker. And Metal Gear Solid 4? Don't make me laugh. That game is stranded on the PS3 and shows no signs of being put anywhere else, not for the last 14 years. Metal Gear Solid 5 is the only game in the series easily purchasable and playable right this moment, physically and digitally, on several different storefronts on multiple currently supported platforms. The only one. As it currently stands, the most efficient way to play all of the canon Metal Gear Solid games without resorting to emulation is buying a used PS3 and a copy of the Metal Gear Solid Legacy Collection, which contains Metal Gear 1 and 2, Metal Gear Solid 1 through 4, and Peace Walker, then buying Metal Gear Solid 5 on a modern platform of your choice. You have to seek out a console that ended production 5 years ago to play the majority of one of the most successful, inventive, and beloved franchises of all time. What a pain in the ass. Compare this to something like Kingdom Hearts or the Yakuza series. Square Enix and Sega have been going out of their way to port all entries of these franchises onto as many modern platforms as they can, making it easy for new fans to join in. And, it goes without saying, but Metal Gear Solid isn't the only series stuck on PS3. There's Infamous 1 and 2, the entire Ratchet & Clank Future series, Killzone 2 and 3, the original Demon's Souls, the Resistance trilogy, the Motorstorm trilogy, God of War Ascension, Gran Turismo 5 and 6, and more, including multiple HD collections featuring games that are even older. Some of these games released as recently as 2013, so they're not even 10 years old yet, but they're already stranded on the one console in Sony's history that is a pain in the ass to make backwards compatibility support for. The closest solution available for some of these, beyond emulation, is cloud streaming via PlayStation Now. Ugh. Some actual game developers have utilized emulators inside the re-releases of their old games. The most recent publicized example is probably none other than Nintendo. The release of Super Mario 3D All-Stars came with the discovery that all three of the games featured in the bundle were running off custom-made emulators within the game files. Oh, and this is on top of the emulation used for the Virtual Console service on the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, where you were able to play a variety of games from older consoles, including consoles not even owned by Nintendo, such as the Sega Genesis, Neo Geo, Commodore 64, and PC Engine. Combine this with the aforementioned software-based backwards compatibility in early PS3 models and the Xbox One and Series X's current backwards compatibility support, and a precedent does exist already for all three console manufacturers putting emulators in their machines. They are no strangers to doing this already. All of the frustrations surrounding the inability to play old games would be easily alleviated if the companies that make the platforms we play on offered a more robust way of playing them. If the PS5 had regular insert disc and play backwards compatibility by way of emulation, it'd be so much easier. The people over at Xbox gave a valiant effort in handpicking games to support and test, and I do commend them for it and would not blame Sony for doing the same thing. But even after their hundreds of thousands of man-hours, they were still only able to get less than a third of the Xbox 360's library and less than a tenth of the original Xbox's library functional, as everything else was off limits due to licensing and legal problems and technical issues. The simple act of placing a good emulator inside these consoles, even if it didn't have a 100% compatibility rate, would be a dramatic step forward in backwards compatibility support. Maybe it won't be a widely used feature that every single PS5 owner touches, but having the vast majority of 4 previous platforms' libraries playable, including the PS3 ideally, would still increase the machine's value by a lot in the eyes of those who harbor any interest in playing old games, whether they already own them or not. The PS1 and PS2 have legendary catalogs stuffed to the brim with classics, and the PSP and PS3 boast some great titles of their own too, including small, hyper-niche games that probably never set foot outside of Japan. People still like those niche games. Oftentimes they need emulation to continue maintaining even the thinnest thread of relevancy. Old games are great. The industry has a very rich history of genre-creating or genre-defining titles that paved the way for major hits we enjoy right now. It would be a shame if any of them were to be lost to time through no fault of their own. And to any younger viewers watching this video, consider this. Maybe your next favorite game might have actually come out before you were even born. It might sound silly at first, but amazing games have always existed, and a lot of them continue to stand the test of time and continually rising standards. This concludes my thoughts on emulation and maintaining a connection to old games. Hopefully my point was clear enough. It's meant to be informative, but it's also a bit of a rant on my part. It's obviously a pretty serious subject for me, and I get a little passionate. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.